He stood in a room filled with screams and the smell of iron. Blood stained the floors. Flies buzzed over open wounds. Doctors worked quickly, not out of skill, but out of fear, because in that era, in the 1800s, every surgery was a gamble with death. A simple cut could become a sentence. A broken bone could turn into a burial. And yet, among the chaos, one quiet man looked at the horror and refused to accept it. His name was Joseph Lister, and his hands changed the meaning of life itself. If you've ever survived an operation, if you've ever seen a hospital save a life, you owe it, in part, to him. He stood in the shadow of death and said, "No more." In the mid-19th century, hospitals were not places of healing. They were houses of pain, echoing with moans, thick with the smell of blood, pus, and decay. Doctors wore their pride in the stains on their coats. The dirtier the jacket, the greater the surgeon's reputation. They believed infection was a mystery, a punishment from the heavens, or something carried by the patient's own blood. They didn't wash their hands. They didn't clean their tools. Between one patient's death and the next, they simply wiped the blade on their apron and cut again. And almost everyone who went under the knife died. But Lister, he saw what others ignored. He watched as wounds rotted and turned black. He saw mothers die after childbirth, soldiers after amputations, and he asked the question others were too arrogant to ask. What if death was not destiny? What if it was preventable? Joseph Lister was not born to be a rebel. He was born in 1827 in England, into a Quaker family that valued humility and discipline. His father, Joseph Jackson Lister, was a pioneer himself, a man who improved the microscope. Through that lens, young Joseph learned to see what others couldn't. He would sit for hours, peering into glass slides, studying cells, watching tiny worlds move in silence. That habit, that quiet observation, became his weapon. Because where others saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where others blamed God, he looked for science. He entered medicine at a time when surgery was brutal. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, no understanding of germs. A surgeon's success was judged not by healing, but by how quickly he could cut. Speed, not safety, was glory. But even then, Lister was different. He was not fascinated by blood, but by healing. He didn't chase fame, he chased truth. The world around him was changing. Science was beginning to challenge old traditions. And one discovery, one idea, would alter Lister's path forever. In 1865, the French chemist Louis Pasteur revealed a radical theory. Invisible microorganisms, germs, cause decay and disease. To most doctors, it sounded absurd. They couldn't see these germs. They couldn't believe that tiny unseen life forms could bring down strong men. But Lister listened. He had looked through microscopes. He knew the unseen was real. And in Pasteur's words, he found a key to the mystery that haunted him. Why did wounds kill? If germs caused infection, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could stop them. Lister began to experiment quietly in his hospital in Glasgow. He had seen the horror of amputations, the blackening of flesh, the slow death of infection. He wanted to find a way to stop it. He studied different chemicals, searching for something that could kill invisible enemies. Finally, he turned to carbolic acid, a substance used to clean sewage. If it could disinfect the foulest water, he thought, perhaps it could also protect the human body. And so he tried it. A young boy had broken his leg badly. In those days, such injuries often meant amputation or death. Lister cleaned the wound with carbolic acid, wrapped it in a dressing soaked with the same solution, and waited. Days passed, then weeks. No pus, no fever, no death. The wound healed, cleanly, perfectly. It was a miracle, but to Lister, it was proof. He had found a way to stop invisible death. But the world did not celebrate him. It laughed at him. Other surgeons mocked the idea of germs. They called it superstition dressed as science. They refused to believe that their own hands, their own tools, could be the instruments of death. They said, "We've been cutting for decades without these silly rituals. Why change now?" But Lister, he refused to retreat. He cleaned his instruments, washed his hands, sterilized his bandages. His surgeries became slower, quieter, more methodical. He demanded discipline, not just from himself, but from everyone in his theater. He was not just fighting disease, he was fighting arrogance. And slowly, his results began to speak louder than ridicule. Where others lost patience, he saved them. Where wounds festered, his healed. And the whispers began to spread about the man who could operate without death following him home. In hospital wards once soaked in tragedy, new life began to emerge. Lister's methods, his antiseptic technique, were transforming medicine. He used carbolic spray to disinfect the air. He cleaned the surgeon's hands, the tools, the bandages. And for the first time in medical history, the death rate after surgery dropped from 50% to almost zero. It was not magic, it was discipline. In his journal, he wrote, "When I first saw the results, I could hardly believe my eyes. It was as if death itself had been banished from the operating room." Eventually, the world could no longer ignore him. Doctors who once laughed began to imitate his work. Hospitals across Europe and America adopted his methods. Even Queen Victoria herself, after a surgical procedure, requested that Lister be her surgeon, because she trusted the man who had tamed infection. And when her wound healed without trouble, the entire British Empire took notice. Lister's once ridiculed philosophy became the new foundation of modern surgery, and with it a new era began, one where human hands could heal without killing. Lister never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as a servant of truth. He continued to refine his methods, teaching generations of doctors that cleanliness is compassion and discipline is mercy. He did not chase wealth or fame. He avoided the spotlight, preferring his quiet laboratory, his notes, his microscope. When asked about his legacy, he simply said, "I only seek to lessen the suffering of mankind." And he did. Every sterile scalpel, every sanitized hospital, every clean bandage in the world today carries his invisible fingerprint. But behind every triumph is sacrifice. Lister's obsession with precision isolated him. He often worked late into the night, his hands cracked from carbolic acid, his mind consumed by responsibility. He lost friends who mocked his peculiar methods. He endured years of loneliness, ridicule, and self-doubt. But he never stopped, because in his heart he knew what the future demanded, that human life deserved better than ignorance. And that belief carried him through the darkness. By the end of his life, Joseph Lister had seen the impossible become routine. Hospitals that were once slaughterhouses became sanctuaries of healing. Surgeons who once carried death in their pockets now carried hope in their hands. He had not just saved lives, he had changed the meaning of medicine. Even the word Listerine, the famous antiseptic, was named in his honor, a symbol of his eternal impact, a reminder that cleanliness and care can be the difference between life and death. When he passed away in 1912, the world mourned not a man, but a principle, the belief that knowledge can conquer suffering. Today, we walk through hospitals lit by bright lights, filled with stainless steel, sterilized instruments, and the hum of machines.